So I'm going to be comparing two fantastic full-frame options by Nikon, the Nikon Z5 II and the Nikon Z6 III. Now, obviously there is a big price difference between these two cameras. Obviously the Z6 Mark III is going to have a lot more specs, but you'll be surprised. It's probably a lot closer than you actually think. So let's compare these. Right from the start, we're going to be talking about the price because this is the big determining factor. If you're going to be picking up one of these or both of these, A cam, B cam, A cam by itself, whatever you're going to do, we need to talk about that price. Now, $44.99 for the Nikon Z6 III and $26.99 for the Nikon Z5 II. Now, obviously this Nikon Z5 II is cheaper. It's more on the entry-level budget full-frame cameras, and I have done a full review of both of these cameras, so you can check that out. But we're going to be looking at these side by side to see which one may fit within your workflow, or you're going to be picking up both of these for A cam, B cam, or even just two Nikon Z5 IIs. So we have to talk about the sensor size difference. Now they are both full frame cameras, they're both 24 megapixels, but the one thing that the Nikon Z6 III has is a partially stacked sensor. So essentially that's going to give you a slightly faster readout when it comes to photos and videos. And when we talk about some of the specs in terms of the photos and videos, that's where we're going to see the differences between these two. Now when it comes to photography, the Nikon Z5 II is absolutely no slouch. It does 14 frames per second in continuous bursts when it comes to that mechanical shutter, which is pretty amazing when it comes to an entry-level full-frame camera. And similarly, the Nikon Z6 III actually does the same, 14 frames per second in that mechanical shutter. But when we switch it over to electronic shutter, this is where both of these differ quite drastically. So the Nikon Z5 II actually does 30 frames per second in electronic shutter, whereas the Nikon Z6 III actually does 20 frames per second with electronic shutter with full continuous autofocus, but you can also do 60 frames per second in that full frame mode, but you do lose that continuous autofocus, or you can go a DX crop and get 120 frames per second in electronic shutter. That is absolutely incredible. Now, in terms of the design and build quality, they're almost the same. The Nikon Z5 II pretty much has the same buttons on the back. It's the top that varies just a little bit. The Nikon Z6 III actually has a small screen at the top, which actually displays some of your settings. And the dial is on the right-hand side when it comes to the Z5 II, but on the Z6 III, it's on the left-hand side. And now when it comes to the EVF, in the Nikon Z5 II, you have a 3.69 million dot EVF, whereas the Nikon Z6 III has a 5.76 million dot EVF. So it's slightly higher resolution, a little bit more quality when it comes to looking through that EVF. So if that is something that you take into consideration when purchasing these, then obviously the Z6 III is a better option there. But that 3.69 million dots is absolutely no slouch. Now when it comes to that back screen, we both have a 3.2 inch 2.1 million dot fully articulating screen. So they're pretty much exactly the same there. I love these articulating screens. They feel really solid and well built, but obviously if you are in front of the camera, you can see yourself, but you can utilize that flip screen for low vertical shots or over the top of crowds. Whole bunch of different ways you can utilize these flip screens. Now, when it comes to the battery, they both use the identical battery. It's the ENEL15C battery. So they're fantastic. I mean, if you are doing a whole day's worth of shooting, it is very good practice to get a couple of these anyway. But if you're doing some extremely long shoots, then maybe 2 or 3 of these to, utilize that whole shoot. Alternatively, you can actually get the battery grip as well, which has pretty much 2 batteries, which is obviously a little bit better ergonomically for photographers. Really depends on how you actually want to be shooting. Now, when it comes to the I/O ports, this is where we're going to see a little bit of a difference when it comes to video shooters, because the Nikon Z6 III has a full-size HDMI, whereas the Z5 II has a micro HDMI. Now, whether this is going to matter for you or not, it really depends on the person, but a lot of videographers will prefer the full-size HDMI just because it's a thicker cord. It has less chance of it actually breaking. But if you are just using the camera by itself, I mean, it doesn't really matter, obviously, what kind of I/O ports you have on the side there. But they both do have a 3.5 mic jack in and a headphone jack out for that monitoring. And they both have USB-C on the side, obviously for data transfer, firmware updates, or charging directly into the camera. Now, when it comes to the card slots as well, this is one thing that the Z5 II actually does pretty well, and that's 2 card slots. Sure, they are 2 SD card slots, but for an entry-level full-frame camera, you don't really see 2 card slots. Whereas the Z6 Mark III has a CF Express Type B card, but also an SD card slot as well. And when we talk about the internal recording of the video codecs, you'll understand why the Z6 Mark III has a CF Express Type B card. Okay, so the video codecs. This is where the Z6 Mark III is really going to shine, and videographers are going to love this. So now we got to talk about what this Z6 Mark III sensor can give you. Now, it's a partially stacked sensor. It's 24 megapixels, but it is absolutely incredible. You're able to do the 12-bit NRAW internal with 6K resolution up to 60 frames per second. And if you do want slow motion, you can pretty much do 4K at 120 frames per second with a DX crop with that NRAW. But then you can also do ProRes RAW at 6K 30 frames per second, or just a bit higher than 4K at 60 frames per second in that ProRes RAW. But also Nikon gives you the opportunity to do 422HQ 10-bit in ProRes, which gives you 5.4K at 30 frames per second, or standard 4K at 60 frames per second, or you can do 1080p at 120 frames per second with that ProRes 422HQ. Otherwise, you do have your standard H.265 10-bit, which is 5.4K at 60 frames per second. You got 4K at 120 frames per second with that DX crop, or you can do 1080p at 240 frames per second. And with the Z5 II, it's pretty much stripped back. You've just got regular 4K at 60 frames per second, but it is a DX crop, or you can do 4K at 30 frames per second full frame, or 1080p at 120 frames per second. But you do also have NRAW 12-bit internal, but it is only 4032 by 2268 at 30 frames per second. So it is just a little bit higher than standard 4K. But there is no ProRes or ProRes RAW internal into this camera. So if you do want to see the image quality in terms of all the recording codecs that we do have in the Z6 III, I absolutely recommend go see my full review of this camera. It is absolutely incredible. It's one of my favorite cameras to film on. And I did put it through a whole bunch of different scenarios that I normally would put these cameras through. And similarly with the Z5 II, absolutely recommend go see my full review of that camera as well. I did put it through a couple of different scenarios, and for the price that it's actually situated at, it is an incredibly capable camera when it comes to that video work. And obviously stills as well. It is very hard to distinguish the difference between some of these cameras when it comes to photography. It really does just come down to what specs that you need in the specific camera. That's why I love doing these side by sides, to really etch out what you guys want in a camera. Now, looking at the 4K 25 frames per second side by side, you're never going to notice the difference. Now, there obviously is a slight color difference because I'm using 2 different ND filters here, so don't take color into consideration. But when we do go to the 5.4K comparing against the 4K, you're just going to get more resolution within that 5.4K. If you put it onto the 4K timeline, you just have more resolution to move around the frames. So you're really going to get very similar image quality between the 2 cameras, just more flexibility in post-production with the Z6 III because you have higher resolution to play with. So it's without doubt that in the Z6 III, 4K at 120 frames per second is going to be better than the Nikon Z5 II's 1080p at 120 frames per second. But I do have to mention that this 4K 100 frames per second in the Z6 III is a DX crop as well. So this is framed up to be the same as the full frame in the Nikon Z5 II. But if you put them side by side, it really is very difficult to tell. It's when you do put it on this 4K timeline is when you do see a slight resolution drop, obviously in that 1080p compared to the 4K footage. But side by side, I mean, they look so close, and that 1080p and 120 frames per second is absolutely usable in the Z5 II. So when it comes to internal stabilization on this, they both have IBIS, which is about 5 stops, and they work perfectly fine, pretty much identical between the 2 cameras. It's when I actually put it into the electronic stabilization mode is where I saw a very slight difference. It does look like the Z5 II works a little bit too hard when it comes to stabilizing those jitters. Now, this was at a 50mm lens, so it is a pretty long focal length. You will see it being a little bit more difficult for cameras to handle long focal lengths. That's why I always choose the 50mm because it's kind of like that standard. But if you are walking and vlogging with, say, a 16mm lens, then both of these are going to perform pretty much identical. Now, in terms of the autofocus performance on both of these cameras, they're pretty much identical when it comes to object tracking for people, animals, cars, planes. It works perfectly fine. Obviously, you do have to dial in the speed and the strength of what you want when it comes to how tacky this is going to be. But in terms of autofocus and the competition, like Nikon are doing extremely well in these kind of cameras, and it really obviously depends on what kind of lenses you pair it with as well. But I have absolutely no issues with a lot of different situations where the autofocus was just completely sticky. It works perfectly fine, and you're pretty much going to expect identical performance between these two cameras. So look, overall, when it comes to that video and all the outputs, obviously the Z6 Mark III is going to shine, but the Nikon Z5 II is absolutely no slouch when it comes to video. You know, that 4K 25 frames per second or 30 frames per second is pure magic. It looks absolutely incredible. Obviously, you do have that DX crop when you go into that 4K slow motion, and you only have 1080p at 120 frames per second, whereas this Z6 Mark III can actually do 4K at 120 frames per second, which is pretty phenomenal. But it also does 1080 at 240 frames per second. So if you are a video shooter that loves slow motion, it's a no-brainer to get the Z6 Mark III. But if you're a video shooter that only uses slow motion, you know, occasionally, the Z5 II is a big shout. So look, overall, if you're going to be choosing the Nikon Z5 II or the Nikon Z6 Mark III, it really depends on what you're shooting and what kind of specs is actually needed in terms of your workflow. But majority of the cases, the Z5 II is going to suit a lot of people, specifically at that really nice cheap price point. But if you are pretty serious in terms of video and photo, the Z6 Mark III clearly is an absolute beast. So thanks for watching, my friends. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please give it a thumbs up. I will put a link in the description below for both of these cameras if you do want to check these out. And yeah, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.